Hello, my friends. Some days in this conflict are little more than routine news cycles, statements, reactions, recycled outrage. Other days, however, reveal structural shifts beneath the surface, moments when several events intersect and make one thing unmistakably clear. The old order is cracking, and those still clinging to slogans about a rules-based international system are being overtaken by hard strategic reality. I begin with the seized oil tanker, the vessel that has gone by an almost absurd number of names: Bell 1, later renamed Mariner, then Marinero, Marinera. Beneath the name changes lies a serious issue. On board were 2 Russian citizens and approximately 20 Ukrainian crew members. The most important development is that the 2 Russian citizens have been released. The Trump administration freed them, and they are returning to Russia. Moscow, through its foreign ministry spokesperson, officially expressed gratitude to the U.S. leadership. This was not a sentimental humanitarian gesture. It was a calculated decision designed to prevent a controllable incident from turning into an uncontrollable escalation. When a state truly believes it can impose its will without consequence, it does not feel compelled to release the other side's citizens. The fact that Washington did so tells us something important. There are limits the United States does not want to cross, at least not now. It reflects restraint born not of goodwill, but of risk awareness. From there, attention shifts to Europe, and notably not to Paris but to Rome. Giorgia Meloni has changed her tone. She is now saying that it is time for Europe to speak with Russia, even suggesting that Macron is right on this point. I am not inclined to praise Macron. He has reversed his position on Russia so many times over the past 2 years that inconsistency has become his defining trait. Talk to Russia, don't talk to Russia. Coalition troops, no coalition troops, repeat endlessly. The real story is not Macron, it is Meloni. Her shift did not come from moral awakening or diplomatic idealism. It came from a weapon system with a name: Oreshnik. Oreshnik accomplished in one strike what countless summits failed to do. It forced political leaders to confront reality. Russia carried out its second Oreshnik strike against western Ukraine in the Lviv region. This alone shattered a central Western illusion, that western Ukraine was somehow a sanctuary, a zone where troops could be stationed, logistics could operate, and strategic planning could proceed without risk. Oreshnik demolished that assumption. The missile traveled a long distance at such speed that there were no sirens, no alarms, no Patriot systems, no air defenses of any kind reacting in time. This was not because Ukraine lacked determination, but because the threat itself exists at a technological level beyond what current Western-supplied systems can reliably counter. The imagery following impact was unmistakable. This was not symbolic messaging, it was raw, destructive power. Multiple analysts believe the strike hit, or was intended to hit, the strategic gas storage facility at Stry, near the Polish border. This facility, built during the Soviet period, is believed to be the largest in Europe. The Soviet Union understood how to build strategic infrastructure at scale and depth, something modern Europe has largely forgotten. Stry reportedly holds roughly 50% of Ukraine's gas reserves and between 30 and 35% of Europe's stored gas. In other words, this is not merely Ukrainian infrastructure. It is European energy security. There is not yet absolute independent confirmation that this specific facility was struck, but what matters strategically is that the Russian Ministry of Defense has confirmed the use of Oreshnik in the Lviv region. Moscow framed the strike as part of a larger precision campaign involving land and sea-based long-range weapons and UAVs, targeting facilities tied to drone production and the energy infrastructure supporting Ukraine's military-industrial complex. Russia explicitly linked this strike to Ukrainian drone attacks against the Russian president's residence in the Novgorod-Valdai area on the 29th of December 2025. Whether one accepts that narrative or not is secondary to the strategic message. Attacks on Russian leadership symbols will be answered with strikes on critical Ukrainian and indirectly European assets. If Stry was indeed compromised, the consequences extend far beyond Ukraine. Europe would be staring at renewed energy instability, and more importantly, would be forced to recognize that there is no safe rear area in Ukraine for Western military ambitions. This is the real message sent to the E3 France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, who had just concluded discussions in Paris about a letter of intent to deploy troops to Western Ukraine after a ceasefire. Their internal logic was that such forces would be far from the front, and therefore beyond Russian reach. Oreshnik answered that assumption with brutal clarity. There is no beyond reach. And Hemsen, there is an additional layer that makes this message even more sobering. Oreshnik is believed to be nuclear capable. Given its speed and flight profile, it would arrive without warning. When Putin previously stated that this weapon could not be intercepted and challenged others to try, he was not posturing. He was describing a real capability. This is an uncomfortable truth for Western policymakers, but ignoring it does not make it disappear. What follows is almost tragicomic. Some European officials continue to respond as if issuing statements could substitute for strategy. Kaja Kallas declared that Russia does not want peace, that it responds to diplomacy with missiles, and that the EU must dig deeper into its air defense stocks to support Ukraine. This raises a simple, unavoidable question. Which air defense system can stop Oreshnik? If there is no answer, then calls to provide more air defense are little more than ritualized political speech words designed to signal activity rather than achieve results. Context matters. Prior to the Oreshnik strike, Ukraine attacked a Russian tanker in the Black Sea near Novorossiysk and carried out strikes on Belgorod, causing massive power outages affecting hundreds of thousands of civilians. One does not have to approve of Russia's response to understand that Moscow is setting escalation thresholds and enforcing them. The message is consistent. Every strategic vulnerability is on the table. Meanwhile, according to Axios, Trump advisors met Russian representatives in Paris and presented what is described as the Ukrainian peace plan. This plan, agreed upon by Zelensky and European leaders, again revolves around security guarantees and the deployment of Western troops in Ukraine. Russia has rejected this concept repeatedly, unequivocally, and without ambiguity. No NATO troops, no Western troops, regardless of geography. Bringing the same proposal to Moscow yet again is not diplomacy, it is theater. It allows Western leaders to claim they tried without altering the fundamental conditions that make agreement impossible. Zelensky, for his part, is reportedly preparing another trip to Washington to finalize security guarantees with Trump. One cannot help but notice that Zelensky appears to spend more time outside Ukraine than inside it. This is not merely optics, it reflects a political structure in which decisions affecting Ukraine are increasingly made elsewhere, with Kyiv functioning more as a node than a center of power. Then there is Trump himself. In an interview with the New York Times, he openly stated that his authority as commander-in-chief is constrained only by his own morality, dismissing international law as irrelevant. This statement effectively destroys the rhetorical foundation of the so-called rules-based international order that Europe has relied on for decades. When the U.S. president says international law does not bind him, the implication is clear. Power, not law, governs outcomes. States capable of real pushback, Russia, China, India, will note this and adapt, but they are not panicked, they have leverage. Europe, however, should be deeply unsettled. Its entire post-Cold War security identity rests on the assumption that law, norms, and American guarantees form a stable framework. If those guarantees depend solely on the personal morality of whoever occupies the White House, Europe's strategic foundation is alarmingly fragile. Trump has also spoken openly about potential land strikes against cartels, referencing Mexico, and about Iran being in very bad shape. U.S. officials speak confidently about Iran nearing collapse, though the situation is more volatile than conclusive. Internet shutdowns, misinformation, recycled protest footage, and the selective activation of Starlink suggest a familiar pattern of information warfare and external manipulation, rather than a clean revolutionary moment. At the same time, Syria is heating up again. Fighting in Aleppo between forces now labeled the Syrian army under new authority and the SDF, backed by Kurdish elements, reveals another layer of geopolitical opportunism. Strip away the slogans and alliances, and one outcome becomes clear. Turkey sees a window to strike Kurdish forces and is moving to exploit it. Greenland adds yet another dimension. Reports that the United States is considering direct payments to Greenlanders to encourage secession from Denmark reflect an openly transactional, imperial approach. European responses remain vague and rhetorical, despite the fact that Europe's leverage in this scenario is minimal. One cannot meaningfully oppose a power on which one's own security ultimately depends. All of this leads to a conclusion that cannot be avoided. Oreshnik is not just another weapon, it is a marker. It forces pragmatic leaders like Maloney to reassess assumptions, because it exposes the danger of believing in safe zones, limited escalation, and consequence-free posturing. It demonstrates that the West can talk endlessly about sanctions, air defenses, and stockpiles, but when faced with a capability it cannot counter, rhetoric collapses. The world is no longer governed by a PDF of international rules. It is governed by power, reach, and the ability to impose costs that cannot be mitigated. Russia has just demonstrated that it possesses such capabilities. Many in the West are reluctant to admit it, but yesterday's strike in Lviv was not just a battlefield event, it was a strategic message to Europe, to NATO planners, And to anyone still imagining that Western Ukraine could become a protected rear area, there are no sanctuaries, no exemptions, and no safe assumptions left standing. What follows from these events is not merely a shift in tactics, but a deeper transformation in how power is exercised and understood. The Oreshnik strike did not just invalidate the myth of Western Ukraine as a sanctuary, it also exposed the intellectual bankruptcy of Western escalation theory. For years, NATO planners and political leaders have operated under a set of assumptions inherited from the post-Cold War era, that Russia could be pressured incrementally, sanctioned indefinitely, and managed through calibrated provocation without forcing a decisive response. That framework has now collapsed. The West's preferred model has always been escalation without accountability. Sanctions are imposed not as instruments to reach a negotiated outcome, but as punitive rituals meant to demonstrate moral superiority. Weapons are delivered not to end wars, but to sustain them at a level deemed politically manageable. Diplomatic initiatives are launched not to compromise, but to reinforce predetermined outcomes. Oreshnik interrupts this entire logic. It is not simply another rung on an escalation ladder. It is a weapon that short-circuits the ladder itself. This is why the strike reverberated far beyond Ukraine. Energy markets reacted not because analysts suddenly discovered vulnerability, but because they were reminded of something they had chosen to forget. Infrastructure matters, geography matters, and distance no longer guarantees safety. Europe has built its strategic comfort on the belief that modern warfare could be contained to front lines, while economic life continued uninterrupted elsewhere. That belief is a luxury, and luxuries disappear quickly in real wars. The reaction in Brussels and other European capitals has been revealing. Publicly, officials repeat familiar language: condemnation, calls for unity, demands for more weapons deliveries. Privately, however, a different conversation is unfolding. The question is no longer whether Ukraine can win, but whether Europe can absorb the consequences of continued escalation. This is the unspoken dilemma behind Meloni's shift. Her comments are not ideological. They are pragmatic. They reflect an awareness that Europe is approaching a threshold beyond which it loses control over outcomes. At the same time, Washington's behavior signals a growing contradiction. On one hand, American political rhetoric grows more absolutist, more dismissive of international law, more openly coercive. On the other hand, U.S. actions remain cautious where direct confrontation with Russia is concerned. The release of Russian citizens from the seized tanker fits this pattern perfectly. It is a reminder that behind public bravado lies a recognition of risk. The United States is willing to pressure, intimidate, and sanction, but it remains reluctant to test Russia directly in a scenario where escalation cannot be managed. This gap between rhetoric and reality is dangerous. It creates false confidence among allies and false expectations among adversaries. European leaders, hearing American statements about limitless resolve, assume backing that may not materialize in extremis. Ukrainian leadership, encouraged by declarations of unwavering support, continues to act under the assumption that Western escalation will always follow Ukrainian escalation. Russia, meanwhile, is adjusting its calculus based not on words, but on observed behavior. The Kremlin's message is becoming increasingly explicit. If the West insists on treating Ukraine as a platform for strategic pressure, then Russia will treat European interests as part of the battlefield. This does not require attacks on NATO territory to be effective. Energy infrastructure, logistics networks, financial stability, and political cohesion are all pressure points. Oreshnik demonstrates that Russia possesses tools capable of targeting those pressure points without triggering immediate, automatic responses. This brings us to the broader strategic environment. The world is no longer unipolar, and it is no longer governed by Western norms alone. Yet Western institutions continue to behave as if moral authority substitutes for material power. Statements about international law ring hollow when the same actors openly acknowledge that law constrains only those who choose to respect it. Trump's assertion that his own morality is the sole limit on American power is not an aberration, it is a blunt articulation of a principle that has guided U.S. behavior for decades, now simply stated without euphemism. For countries outside the Western Bloc, this clarity is instructive. Russia, China, and others do not interpret such statements as shocking revelations, they see them as confirmation. What alarms Europe is not the sentiment itself, but the realization that the protective fiction of a rules-based order may no longer shield it. Europe lacks the strategic autonomy, military capacity, and political unity to operate comfortably in a world where power is openly transactional. Ukraine sits at the center of this contradiction. Its leadership continues to travel, negotiate, and appeal, projecting confidence while its territory absorbs the consequences of escalation. Yet every new strike, every new weapons delivery, every new rhetorical commitment narrows the space for a negotiated settlement. The more Ukraine is framed as a front line of Western resolve, the less room there is for compromise, and the more likely it becomes that Russia will pursue decisive outcomes rather than incremental ones. Oreshnik should be understood in this context. It is not about terror for terror's sake, it is about compressing timelines. By demonstrating capabilities that negate Western assumptions, Russia forces decision makers to confront choices they have postponed, continue down the current path, and Europe risks deeper economic and social instability. Attempt to freeze the conflict without addressing Russian security demands, and the cycle resumes. A genuine diplomatic reset would require acknowledging realities that Western politics has so far refused to admit. What we are witnessing, then, is not simply an escalation of war, but an erosion of illusions. The illusion that technology guarantees defense, the illusion that distance equals safety, the illusion that sanctions alone can determine outcomes, the illusion that moral language can override strategic imbalance. Each of these assumptions has been weakened, if not destroyed, by recent events. Russia is no longer signaling, it is conditioning. There is a critical difference. Signaling seeks acknowledgement, conditioning reshapes behavior. Oreshnik was not deployed to persuade Western leaders through fear alone. It was deployed to force recalculation by demonstrating that delay itself carries escalating costs. In classical deterrence theory, credibility is everything. Russia is no longer asking to be believed. It is showing that disbelief is dangerous. This is where Western strategy falters most dramatically. NATO's internal logic still assumes that escalation is reversible, that pressure can be increased and decreased like a dial, but modern high-velocity warfare does not work that way. Certain thresholds, once crossed, permanently alter the environment. Oreshnik represents such a threshold. Once a weapon system is used operationally, especially against strategic depth rather than frontline formations, the psychological map of the conflict changes. Actors behave differently not because they are convinced, but because they are constrained. Western leaders now face a paradox they helped create. They have insisted that Russia must not be allowed to win, while simultaneously avoiding the actions required to defeat Russia militarily. This contradiction produces paralysis. Ukraine is encouraged to fight indefinitely, yet denied the means to fundamentally change the battlefield balance. Europe speaks of endurance, while its economic and social resilience erodes. The United States projects resolve while quietly limiting direct exposure. Oreshnik cuts through this contradiction by making indefinite management increasingly untenable. What is becoming clearer by the day is that Russia's war aims have evolved. This does not mean they are unlimited or irrational. On the contrary, they have become more concrete. The initial phase of the conflict revolved around Ukraine itself, NATO expansion, security guarantees, neutral status. The current phase increasingly targets the broader system that sustains Ukrainian resistance. That system is not located solely in Kiev. It is embedded in European infrastructure, financial flows, logistics corridors, and political decision-making. This is why strikes on energy, transport, and industrial nodes carry strategic meaning far beyond immediate damage. They are not about punishment, they are about leverage. They force European governments to weigh domestic stability against ideological commitments. They turn abstract solidarity into tangible cost. Oreshnik is not just a weapon of war, it is a weapon of strategic compression, shrinking the time available for comfortable indecision. At the same time, Russia benefits from a form of escalation, asymmetry. Western systems are optimized for visibility, legality, and consensus. Russian systems are optimized for speed, ambiguity, and unilateral decision-making. This asymmetry favors the actor willing to act first and explain later. Western democracies, bound by coalition politics and public narrative management, move slowly even when they recognize danger. Russia does not share this constraint. This asymmetry also explains why European rhetoric sounds increasingly detached from events. Calls for more sanctions persist despite diminishing returns. Appeals for more air defense continue even when confronted with weapons that bypass air defense altogether. This is not strategic blindness. It is institutional inertia. Bureaucracies repeat what they know how to say long after those words lose operational relevance. Meanwhile, Washington's posture grows more contradictory. Trump's public dismissal of international law may shock European audiences, but from Moscow's perspective, it merely confirms long-held assumptions. What matters more is not what Trump says, but what he avoids doing. There is no rush toward direct confrontation, no appetite for testing red lines in ways that cannot be walked back. This reinforces Russia's belief that escalation dominance lies with the actor willing to absorb risk rather than broadcast virtue. Ukraine, tragically, remains caught between these forces. Its leadership continues to operate as if political momentum can substitute for material advantage. Frequent travel, constant appeals, and carefully staged diplomatic events create the appearance of agency, but they do not alter battlefield physics. Each new Western promise raises expectations that cannot be fulfilled without crossing lines the West itself fears to cross. This gap between promise and capacity widens with every passing month. Russia understands this dynamic intimately. It is not trying to collapse Ukraine overnight. It is allowing pressure to accumulate, knowing that systems break not at their strongest points, but at their weakest. Energy shortages, economic fatigue, political fragmentation, and social stress are cumulative phenomena. They do not require spectacular victories, they require persistence. Oreshnik fits perfectly into this approach. It reminds everyone involved that Russia retains escalation options that have not yet been exhausted. There is also a global audience watching closely. Countries outside the Euro-Atlantic bloc are drawing conclusions not from speeches, but from outcomes. They see a West that speaks the language of universality while acting through coercion. They see Russia respond not with slogans, but with capability. This matters because legitimacy in the emerging multipolar order is increasingly tied to effectiveness rather than moral framing. The longer the conflict continues under its current logic, the more normalized these dynamics become. Exceptional measures become routine, strategic strikes become expected, political shock gives way to resignation. This is the danger zone for Europe, because adaptation under pressure rarely favors fragmented systems. Russia's centralized decision-making allows it to set pace and direction. Europe reacts. By this stage, the conflict is no longer just about Ukraine's borders or sovereignty. It is about whether the West can accept limits to its power without resorting to denial. Oreshnik confronts Western policymakers with an unpleasant truth. There are domains in which Russia holds uncontested advantage, and no amount of rhetorical escalation can erase that fact.